An airport terminal is a place of organized chaos, a river of humanity flowing toward 100 different futures. But for two teenage brothers, 17-year-old twins, Jordan and Jamal Vance, that river was about to be dammed. Standing at gate B12 of JFK International, clutching violin and cello cases worth more than the gate agent's car, they were on the cusp of the biggest performance of their lives. They were two brilliant young men, their faces alight with the nervous energy of ambition. They had their first-class tickets, their passports, and a dream of Vienna. But one woman, armed with a name badge and a corrosive assumption, saw none of that. She saw only a threat. And in the next 60 minutes, a storm of prejudice power and long-buried secrets would erupt right there on the polished linoleum, proving that sometimes the quietest people hold the most thunder. The hum of John F. Kennedy International Airport was a familiar symphony to Jordan and Jamal. It was a composition of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements in a dozen languages, the distant roar of jet engines and the palpable thrum of anticipation. For them, it was the sound of opportunity. They had navigated this particular orchestra of chaos since they were old enough to walk, but today felt different. The air was charged with a unique electricity, a high-frequency note of excitement that vibrated in their bones. At 17, they were on the verge of manhood, identical in their sharp jawlines and deep, intelligent eyes, but divergent in their expressions. Jordan, the cellist, wore his confidence like a well-fitted jacket. His shoulders were broad, his posture erect, and a spark of defiance flickered in his gaze. He was the protector, the speaker, the one who met the world head-on. Jamal, the violinist, was the observer. His energy was more contained, his eyes taking in every detail with a quiet intensity. He saw the world in shades and nuances, his calm a perfect counterpoint to his brother's fire. They were dressed in a way their mother Seraphina called respectable comfort. Dark, tailored travel joggers, crisp designer sweatshirts, and pristine sneakers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. It was a uniform that blended in with the denizens of the first-class cabin. Yet it was precisely this blend of casual luxury and their black skin that often created a dissonance in the eyes of others. "You think Maestro Petrov will actually be there?" Jamal asked, his voice a low murmur as he adjusted the strap of his violin case. The instrument inside was an 18th century Gagliano, a temperamental masterpiece that was his second soul. Jordan scoffed, a grin playing on his lips. "Jamal, it's the Vienna International Music Competition. It's like the Olympics for people who can't run. Of course Petrov will be there. He's probably judging the string finals. The real question is, are you ready to melt his stony Russian face with your Paganini?" Jamal managed a tight smile. "I'm more worried about getting the Gagliano there in one piece. You know how these baggage handlers are." "It's staying with you in the cabin. Mom made sure of it," Jordan said, nudging his brother's shoulder. "Relax. Everything is handled." "Everything is handled," was the unofficial motto of their lives thanks to their mother. Seraphina Vance was a force of nature disguised as a woman. A whirlwind of intellect, ambition, and fierce love. She had raised them alone while building a business empire from the ground up. To them, she was just Mom, the woman who made them practice until their fingers bled, who quizzed them on stock market trends at the dinner table, and who could quell any argument with a single arched eyebrow. They knew she was successful, of course. Their sprawling Manhattan penthouse, their private schooling at Avenue's The World School, and the very fact they were flying first class to Vienna were testaments to that. But Seraphina had deliberately kept the true scale of her success and the specific nature of her business shrouded in a modest privacy. "She doesn't want you growing up to be entitled brats," she'd told them once. "You'll have every advantage, but you will earn your place in this world. Your name opens no doors. Your character, your talent, your hard work, those are the only keys you need." So they walked through the world as Jordan and Jamal Vance, talented musicians, sons of a successful but vaguely defined businesswoman. They never dropped her name, never expected special treatment. Today was no different. They were just two more passengers in the river. As they approached Gate B12, the final boarding call for Aura Air Flight 117 to Vienna was echoing through the terminal. The gate area was a scrum of last-minute passengers and weary staff. Behind the counter stood a woman whose face was set in a mask of permanent disapproval. Her name tag read Karen Miller. She was a woman in her late 40s with hair bleached to a shade of yellow, not found in nature, and a palpable air of someone who had been marinated in petty grievances for years. Her day had been a cascade of minor disasters. A delayed flight from Chicago had caused a domino effect of angry passengers. The coffee machine in the break room was broken, and her manager, Mr. Henderson, had just reprimanded her for her customer-facing tone. Karen Miller felt a deep abiding sense of injustice about her life. She saw herself as a victim of circumstance, a person of unappreciated intelligence and worth, stuck in a job that was beneath her. When she looked at the privileged passengers, swung through her gate, a bitter resentment curdled in her stomach. She saw their designer bags, heard their casual talk of European vacations, and felt a surge of righteous indignation. They hadn't earned it, she thought. Not like she had earned her place, her little kingdom of Gate B12. Her eyes scanned the dwindling line and landed on Jordan and Jamal. She saw their expensive clothes, their confident demeanor, their meticulously cared-for instrument cases. And in the toxic alchemy of her mind, fueled by unconscious bias and personal misery, she didn't see two gifted young musicians. She saw a red flag. Her gaze narrowed. The relaxed posture of the boys. Their easy laughter, it struck her, not as youthful excitement, but as arrogance. The quality of their luggage didn't register as a sign of wealth, but as a sign of something illicit. She straightened up, a small, cruel smile touching her lips. Power for Karen wasn't about flying the plane. It was about deciding who got on it. And she had a feeling these two weren't going anywhere. "Next," she barked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Jordan and Jamal stepped forward, placing their passports and first-class tickets on the counter. "Good afternoon," Jordan said, his voice polite. Karen didn't return the greeting. She picked up their passports, flipping through them with a theatrical slowness. She held them up to the light, squinting as if she were examining a counterfeit bill. "Jordan and Jamal Vance," she said, her tone dripping with suspicion. "And where are you two heading today?" "Vienna," Jamal answered softly, "for a music competition." "A music competition?" Karen repeated the words, tasting like an obvious lie in her mouth. She tapped their tickets. "First class. Very nice. Must be a very important competition." The air quotes were practically visible. Jordan's easygoing demeanor began to stiffen. He recognized this tone. He'd heard it before in high-end stores, from doormen at friends' apartment buildings, from police officers on the street. It was the tone of manufactured suspicion, the presumption of guilt. "Is there a problem?" Jordan asked, his voice losing its warmth. Karen placed their documents down, but kept her hand on them. "I'm going to need to ask you two to step aside," she said, her voice now loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We're going to need to conduct an additional security screening." The overture was over. The first jarring, dissonant chord of the drama had been struck. A bubble of silence formed around the two brothers as Karen Miller's words hung in the air. The river of passengers flowing past the gate slowed, eddying around the sudden obstruction. Heads turned. Eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity, annoyance, and veiled judgment settled on Jordan and Jamal. The feeling of being singled out was a cold weight in their stomachs. "Additional screening," Jordan repeated, his voice tight. "We just came from security. We have TSA pre-check. We went through the scanner like everyone else." "It's a random check, sir," Karen said, the "sir," an insult wrapped in the guise of politeness. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They were hard and accusatory. "Airline policy gives us the right to perform additional screenings at the gate." Jamal, ever the peacemaker, put a hand on his brother's arm. "It's okay, Jordan. Let's just do what she asks, so we can get on the plane." He gave Karen a placating look. "What do you need us to do?" Karen seemed almost disappointed by his compliance. It was a challenge she wanted. "You'll need to open your personal items, all of them. Especially," she said, nodding towards their instrument cases, "those." Jordan's blood ran cold. "No, absolutely not." "Excuse me." Karen's eyebrows shot up. "These are priceless instruments," Jordan explained, his voice rising despite himself. "A Galliano violin and a Testore cello. They can't be opened here. They're climate sensitive. Only a trained luthier is supposed to handle them outside of a controlled environment." He was speaking the absolute truth, a truth he assumed any reasonable person would understand. Karen let out a short, derisive laugh. "A Gagliano." "A Testore, right. And I'm the Queen of England. Open the cases. Now." The confrontation had now escalated from a procedural hurdle to a direct accusation. She wasn't just questioning their right to be there. She was calling them liars. The other passengers were now openly staring, their whispers a low hiss in the background. An older white woman clutched her purse a little tighter. A businessman impatiently checked his Rolex. "Ma'am, we can't," Jamal pleaded, his voice strained. "You don't understand the damage you could cause. We have documentation, appraisals, insurance papers. They're in our carry-on bags. We can show you everything." He started to unzip his backpack, but Karen held up a hand. "I don't want to see your papers," she sneered. "I want to see what's in the cases. For all I know, you could be smuggling anything in there. Drugs, weapons, undeclared goods." She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was paradoxically loud. "I overheard you two in line, talking about a package and a delivery. Don't think I didn't hear you." The absurdity of the accusation was staggering. Jordan remembered the conversation. He had been talking about the package of sheet music their mother had couriered to their hotel in Vienna. But he knew with a sickening certainty that explaining this would be useless. The woman in front of them wasn't operating on logic. She was operating on a script she had written in her head the moment she saw them. "This is insane," Jordan said, his voice shaking with anger. "You're doing this because we're black. Just admit it." The word hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. Karen recoiled as if struck. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her face flushing a blotchy red. "Playing the race card is the oldest trick in the book. I am following protocol. You are being disruptive and uncooperative. I'm calling my manager and airport security." She snatched the phone from its cradle, her hands trembling with self-righteous fury. The scene had reached a point of no return. Within a minute, a man in a slightly ill-fitting suit arrived, a name tag, identifying him as Daniel Henderson, Duty Manager. He was a man whose ambition had outpaced his competence, a corporate climber, who managed by flowchart, and whose primary skill was deflecting blame. He approached Karen first, deliberately ignoring the two brothers. "What's the situation, Miller? These two," she said, pointing a finger, "are refusing a mandatory random security check. Their story is full of holes they're carrying, suspicious large cases, and when I challenged them, they became aggressive and accused me of racism." Henderson's face hardened. An accusation of racism was a paperwork nightmare. The easiest way to handle it was to crush the source of the complaint under the weight of institutional authority. He turned to Jordan and Jamal, his expression one of deep, practiced disappointment. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice oozing condescension, "we have a very simple procedure here at Aura Air. When a member of our staff, a highly trained professional like Ms. Miller, flags a potential security concern, we take it very seriously. Your failure to cooperate is now causing a significant delay for all the other passengers and could be interpreted as a federal offense. She's asking us to open instrument cases that are worth over $1 million combined in the middle of a terminal." Jamal said, his calm finally fracturing. "That's not a reasonable request. It's vandalism." Henderson waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, please, $1 million. Son, I've heard every story in the book. Now you have two choices. You can open the cases right here, right now, or we can have Port Authority security escort you off the premises. We'll cancel your tickets without a refund and place you on the no-fly list for non-compliance. What's it going to be?" The finality in his tone was like a door slamming shut. They were trapped. Their dream of Vienna, the culmination of years of relentless practice, was dissolving in the fluorescent glare of Gate B12. The other passengers were now openly hostile, muttering about making them late. "Just open the damn cases," someone shouted from the back. Jordan felt a surge of pure, hot rage. All his life he had followed the rules. He and his brother were model students, disciplined artists. They had done everything right, and for what? To be humiliated and criminalized by a bitter gate agent and a cowardly manager because their success didn't fit their prejudiced worldview. His hand went to his pocket, pulling out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen. There was only one person who could defuse this bomb. Henderson saw him take out the phone and smirked. "Who are you calling your lawyer? Go ahead. We'll wait." Jordan ignored him. He pressed the call button on the contact, simply labeled Mom. It rang once, twice. He held his breath. "Jordan, is everything okay? You should be boarding." Seraphina Vance's calm, measured voice came through the phone. Tears of frustration pricked at Jordan's eyes. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking, "we have a problem. They won't let us on the plane." A hush fell over the immediate area as Jordan spoke into his phone. The name Mom seemed so mundane, so ordinary, that it momentarily deflated the high drama of the situation. Henderson rolled his eyes, a smug look on his face. He saw it as a child's last desperate act of defiance, calling his mummy. Karen Miller crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently. They were both confident in their authority, secure in the belief that they held all the cards. "What do you mean they won't let you on?" Seraphina's voice on the other end of the line was still calm, but a new edge as sharp and cold as a razor had entered her tone. "They're saying we have to open the cello and violin cases," Jordan explained, his voice low. "The gate agent, a woman named Karen Miller, said she overheard us talking about a package and thinks we're smuggling something. Her manager, a Mr. Henderson, is backing her up. He's threatening to have us arrested and put on the no-fly list if we don't comply." There was a pause on the other end of the line. It wasn't a pause of indecision. It was the silence of a predator calculating its strike. The sound of a car door closing could be heard in the background, followed by the muffled tap-tap-tap of heels on pavement. "Jordan, listen to me very carefully," Seraphina said, her voice now devoid of any warmth, a crystalline instrument of pure command. "Do not open those cases. Do not argue with them any further. Just stand there and wait. What gate are you at?" "B12, Jamal whispered, leaning in close to the phone. "I'm 10 minutes away. I was on my way to the office at LaGuardia, but I'm diverting to JFK. Tell Mr. Henderson that Seraphina Vance is on her way to speak with him personally, and that he is not to let that plane leave the gate until I arrive." Jordan looked up at Henderson, whose smirk was beginning to fade, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "My mother says her name is Seraphina Vance. She says she's on her way, and that you're not to let the plane leave without her." Henderson let out a bark of laughter, though it sounded forced. "Seraphina Vance? Is she supposed to be somebody?" "Look, kid, I don't have time for these games. The captain is signaling for final closure. This is your last chance." "You really should wait," Jordan said, a sliver of his own confidence returning. He had heard that tone in his mother's voice before. It was the tone that had leveled corporate raiders and silenced boardrooms. But Henderson was committed to his course of action. "Security," he called out, waving over 2 Port Authority police officers who had been observing from a distance. "These 2 individuals need to be removed from the gate area." The officers began to walk forward. Jamal's face went pale. The humiliation was about to become a public spectacle, complete with an escort in uniform. The dream was truly over. Jordan stood his ground, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the terminal. 10 minutes, Mum. Please hurry." The next 7 minutes stretched into an eternity. The officers stood by, looking uncomfortable. Henderson conferred with a fuming Karen Miller. The remaining passengers on the plane were likely growing restless. The captain's voice crackled over Karen's walkie-talkie, demanding to know the reason for the delay. Henderson kept giving vague answers about a security situation. And then she arrived. She didn't run or shout. She moved through the terminal with a preternatural calm, a bubble of silence and purpose seeming to move with her. Seraphina Vance was a striking woman in her mid-40s. She was tall and slender, dressed in a bespoke navy blue power suit that screamed quiet authority. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon, and her only jewelry was a pair of simple diamond studs and a classic Cartier watch. Her face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. Every eye in the vicinity was drawn to her as she walked, not because of her beauty, but because of the sheer, unadulterated power she projected. She walked directly to her sons, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "Are you both all right?" she asked, her voice low and for their ears only. They both nodded, the relief so overwhelming it was almost painful. Seraphina then turned her gaze upon Daniel Henderson. It was not a glance. It was a physical force. Henderson, who had been puffing his chest out moments before, seemed to shrink under the intensity of her stare. "Are you Mr. Daniel Henderson?" she asked. Her voice was perfectly level, yet it carried across the gate area like a judgment. "I am," he said, trying to regain his bluster. "And you are?" "My name is Seraphina Vance," she said. The name still didn't register. Henderson, in his mid-level managerial world, was not privy to the upper echelons of the company. "Miss Vance, I'm afraid your sons have caused a serious security issue here. They've refused to comply with standard procedures and have delayed an international flight. Is that so?" Seraphina said, her voice dropping a register. "And what procedure exactly did they refuse to comply with?" Karen Miller, seeing her chance to be validated, stepped forward. I demanded they open these suspicious cases for a random check. They refused. They were belligerent." Seraphina's eyes shifted to Karen Miller. It was like being pinned by a laser. "You are Karen Miller." "Yes," Karen said, lifting her chin defiantly. "Ms. Miller, on what grounds did you deem these two first-class passengers with fully documented pre-approved musical instruments a security risk?" Seraphina asked. "I overheard them talking about packages, and their story about priceless violins seemed far-fetched." Karen stammered, her confidence beginning to crack under the woman's surgical questioning. "Far-fetched?" Seraphina repeated the words as if they were a foreign substance in her mouth. She looked from Karen to Henderson, her gaze sweeping over their shocked and confused faces. The moment had come. "Mr. Henderson, you said you work for Aura Air. I assume you have a company ID." Confused Henderson fumbled for his lanyard and held it up. "Of course." "And on that ID you see the company logo, do you not?" "Yes." "And you see the name of our founder and chief executive officer printed on the back under the corporate charter." Henderson's hands began to tremble. He slowly, hesitantly turned his ID card over. His eyes widened. His face, which had been flushed with arrogance, turned the color of ash. Karen, seeing his expression, peered over his shoulder. A choked gasp escaped her lips. Seraphina Vance watched their faces crumble, her own expression unchanging. "For the benefit of those who are still confused," she announced, her voice ringing with clarity and ice. "My name is Seraphina Vance. I am the founder, majority stockholder, and CEO of Aura Air." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting the full weight of their catastrophic miscalculation crush them. "You have not delayed 2 passengers," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You have delayed my sons. You have not questioned 2 customers. You have accused the children of the woman who signs your paychecks. And you have not merely delayed this flight. You, Mr. Henderson, and you, Ms. Miller, have just grounded your entire careers." The silence that followed Seraphina's declaration was absolute. It was a dense, heavy vacuum where sound and motion ceased to exist. The Port Authority officers froze mid-step. The few remaining gate agents stared with wide, disbelieving eyes. For Daniel Henderson and Karen Miller, the world had tilted on its axis and then fallen away completely, leaving them in a terrifying free-fall. Henderson's mouth opened and closed silently like a fish gasping for air. His face, already pale, seemed to drain of all remaining color. The corporate ladder he had been so desperately climbing had just been kicked out from under him. Karen Miller, on the other hand, began to unravel. The defiant mask shattered, replaced by a desperate, pleading terror. "Mrs. Vance, I didn't know. I was just following protocol. The suspicious packages. I was just trying to be diligent. To protect the airline." Seraphina cut her off with a single sharp look. "Protect the airline, Ms. Miller. You are the single greatest threat to this airline in this terminal today. Your diligence is a thin veil for your bigotry, and your protocol is a weapon you use to harass paying customers who don't fit your narrow world view." She turned her attention back to Henderson, who was now visibly trembling. "Mr. Henderson, as the ranking manager on site, the failure is ultimately yours. You had a chance to de-escalate, to listen, to apply reason. Instead, you chose to escalate. You chose to threaten. You chose to blindly support an employee's prejudiced assumptions over the clear and verifiable evidence of 2 first-class ticket holders. You valued the appearance of authority over the practice of good judgment." She pulled out her own phone and dialed a number from memory. "Robert, it's Seraphina. I'm at JFK Gate B12. Yes, an incident. I need you to dispatch a team from HR and corporate security immediately. I am placing duty manager Daniel Henderson and gate agent Karen Miller on indefinite suspension effective immediately. Have security escort them from the premises. They are to have no further contact with any Aura Air systems or personnel. Their access is to be revoked before they even reach the exit. Is that clear? There was a muffled affirmative on the other end. Seraphina hung up without another word. She had dismantled their careers with the same cool efficiency she would use to close a business deal. There was no shouting, no screaming, just a calm, lethal precision that was far more terrifying. As for this flight, she continued, turning to another younger gate agent who looked on in horror, you will personally escort my sons onto the plane. You will inform the captain that the delay was due to a personnel issue that has been resolved by the CEO. You will ensure their instruments are safely stowed in the first-class cabin closet, as was originally arranged. She then turned to Jordan and Jamal, her expression finally softening as her eyes met theirs. The armor of the CEO fell away, revealing the mother. Go on, she said softly. Go to Vienna. Win that competition. Don't let this ugliness taint what you have worked so hard for. Jamal nodded, still looking dazed. Jordan, however, hesitated. Mum, what about you? I have a mess to clean up, she said. Her eyes flicking back towards the two disgraced employees who were now being approached by airport security. Don't worry about me. I will see you both in Vienna in 2 days to watch you in the finals. It was not a hope. It was a statement of fact. As the brothers were personally led down the jet bridge, they could hear the beginning of the fallout behind them. Henderson was attempting to argue, his voice high and cracking. Karen Miller had started to weep, a pathetic gulping sound that garnered no sympathy. Once seated in their spacious first-class pods, the door to the aircraft closed, sealing them off from the drama. The flight attendants, who had clearly been radioed about the situation, treated them with a new level of reverent deference. The purser, a man named George, came over personally. Mr. Vance, he said, his voice hushed. On behalf of the entire crew, I am so deeply sorry for what you experienced. It is unacceptable and not what Aura Air stands for. Thank you, George, Jamal said quietly. It wasn't your fault. As the plane finally pushed back from the gate and began its powerful taxi toward the runway, Jordan stared out the window, watching the ground fall away as they ascended into the clouds. The ugly scene at the gate felt a world away, yet the residue of the humiliation clung to him. I can't believe that just happened, he said, turning to his brother in the adjacent pod. I can, Jamal replied, his voice heavy. I mean, not the part with Mom showing up like a superhero, but the first part. That felt familiar. Jordan knew what he meant. It was the 1,000 tiny cuts they had endured their whole lives. The store clerks who followed them, the empty taxi that sped past, the surprised looks when they spoke eloquently. This was just the most blatant, most consequential version of it. She didn't just fire them, Jordan mused. She suspended them. Why? Because Mom doesn't just cut out the rot, she studies it, Jamal said, showing the insight that always surprised his brother. She'll have HR do a full investigation. They'll pull their records, interview their colleagues. She'll want to know if this is a pattern, if the system allowed it to happen. She isn't just punishing them. She's diagnosing a disease in her own company. Jordan leaned back in his seat, the luxurious leather, a stark contrast to the cold, hard injustice they had just faced. He felt a new, profound understanding of his mother. He had always seen her strength, her drive. But today, he had seen her power. And he understood now why she had shielded them from it. Power like that was a heavy thing to carry. As they soared over the Atlantic, leaving New York behind, they were no longer just two teenage musicians. They were the sons of Seraphina Vance, a woman who owned the sky. The incident had been a bitter lesson, but it had also been an awakening. They were flying towards their future in Vienna, but they were leaving a storm in their wake. A storm that was about to break wide open and rain consequences down on far more people than just a disgraced gate agent and her manager. The video started with a shaky phone camera pointed discreetly from across the gate area. It captured everything. Karen Miller's sneering condescension, Jordan's rising anger, Daniel Henderson's smug, dismissive threats, and then the arrival. The video's anonymous filmer, a tech CEO on his way to a conference, had recognized Seraphina Vance immediately and kept recording, knowing he was witnessing something extraordinary. He posted it to X, formerly Twitter, with a simple caption, "Incredible scene at JFK. Aura Air staff racially profiles two young black men, tries to have them arrested. Unbeknownst to them, their mother is Seraphina Vance, the airline's CEO. Watch what happens next." The video didn't just go viral. It detonated. By the time Flight 117 was halfway across the Atlantic, the video had millions of views. Aura Air on Fire and Gate were trending worldwide. News outlets from CNN to the BBC had picked it up. Talk shows were already booking aviation experts and race relations commentators. Aura Air, the boutique airline Seraphina, had built from a single leased plane into a symbol of luxury and class, was now the global face of corporate racism. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. In the New York Stock Exchange, Aura Air's ticker symbol AUR was a river of red. When the market opened the next morning, the stock plunged 28% in the first hour of trading. Billions in market capitalization vanished into thin air. Seraphina, working on 3 hours of sleep from a hastily assembled crisis room at the Mark Hotel, watched the numbers bleed out her face an impassive mask. The investigation she ordered into Miller and Henderson had borne bitter fruit. Karen Miller had a documented history of passenger complaints, nearly all of them from people of color, which had been systematically ignored or dismissed by Henderson as customer sensitivity issues. Henderson, it turned out, fostered a toxic work environment, rewarding sycophants and punishing anyone who challenged his authority. They weren't just two bad apples. They were symptoms of a rot that had been allowed to fester in a forgotten corner of her empire. But the stock market and the court of public opinion didn't care about nuance. They saw the video. They saw a company culture that enabled such a disgusting spectacle. Corporate accounts began to cancel their contracts. Celebrities who had once sung Aura Air's praises were now publicly denouncing the airline. The brand, once Seraphina's proudest achievement, was becoming radioactive. And then came the move she should have anticipated. Marcus Thorne, the ruthless shark-like CEO of the sprawling conglomerate, Airline Apex Global Airways, smelled blood in the water. Thorne and Seraphina were old rivals. He had once tried to buy her out when Aura Air was still a fledgling startup, dismissing her as a diversity hire who got lucky. She had rebuffed him, then triumphantly building her airline into a legitimate competitor that poached his wealthiest clients. He had never forgiven her for it. With Aura Air's stock price in freefall and its reputation in tatters, Thorne saw his chance for revenge. Apex Global announced a hostile takeover bid, offering to buy Aura Air's stock at a price that was barely above its currently devastated value. It was a low-ball, insulting offer, but one that cash-strapped, panicked investors might just take. Seraphina's board of directors, once her staunchest allies, were now terrified. They urged her to fight to issue press releases to go on television and apologize. But Seraphina knew it was too late for that. The narrative was set. Any apology would be seen as a desperate act of self-preservation. The true hard consequence of Gate B12 was beginning to crystallize. It wasn't just about 2 employees losing their jobs. The ripple effect from that single act of prejudice was now threatening to sink the entire ship, taking her life's work down with it. The company she had built to be a symbol of excellence was now on the verge of being swallowed by the very man who represented everything she despised about the corporate world: mediocrity, brutality, and a complete lack of soul. She flew to Vienna as promised on one of her own planes, the atmosphere among the crew somber and funereal. She arrived just in time for the final round of the competition, sitting in the gilded splendor of the Vienna concert house, listening to Jamal's violin sing with a heart-breaking purity, and Jordan's cello weep with a profound, soul-stirring melancholy. Seraphina felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She saw her sons not as victims of an ugly incident, but as alchemists who had taken that ugliness and transformed it into breathtaking art. Their music that night was filled with all the pain, anger, and defiant hope of the past few days. They weren't just playing notes. They were telling their story. When Jamal played the final soaring note of his piece, there was a moment of stunned silence in the hall, followed by an eruption of applause that was like thunder. He had won. Jordan, performing later, took second place in his category, a feat that was just as remarkable. Standing backstage holding her sons as they clutched their awards, Seraphina Vance made a decision. She had built an empire of the air. But what good was an empire if its foundations were compromised? What good was her name on the side of a plane, if that name was now synonymous with hate? The world thought Marcus Thorne was about to destroy her. They were wrong. An empire can be rebuilt. A legacy, however, is written in stone. She was about to choose her legacy. The announcement sent shockwaves through the financial world, far greater than the initial scandal. Seraphina Vance would not be fighting the takeover. Instead, she had negotiated the sale of Aura Air to Apex Global Airways directly with Marcus Thorne. The business media called it a surrender. Her rivals called it a defeat. But those who read the fine print saw the truth. It was a masterclass in turning a rout into a strategic retreat. Seraphina had leveraged Thorne's ego against him. She agreed to the sale on several non-negotiable conditions. First, every single Aura Air employee below the level of senior vice president would be guaranteed a job with Apex for a minimum of 5 years at their current salary or higher. Second, all existing routes and contracts would be honored, ensuring no disruption for the customers and communities they served. Third, and most importantly, Apex Global would be required to fund a new independent foundation with a $100 million endowment. The foundation which she would chair would be called the Vance Initiative for Equity and Opportunity. Its sole purpose was to provide scholarships, grants, and mentorship programs for underprivileged youth in the arts, and to fund watchdog groups dedicated to fighting discrimination in the travel and hospitality industries. She sold her company, but she saved her people and birthed a new, more powerful purpose from its ashes. She had lost her throne, but had fundamentally changed the kingdom. Marcus Thorne got his prize, but he was forced to become the reluctant benefactor of the very values he disdained. It was a checkmate so subtle he didn't even realize he'd been beaten. The aftermath settled in over the following months. Karen Miller, fired for gross misconduct, found herself unemployable in the airline industry. The viral video was her permanent resume. The last anyone heard, she was working as a stocker on the night shift at a big box store in a remote suburb. Her face pale and anonymous under the harsh fluorescent lights, a ghost haunting the aisles of bargains and forgotten dreams. Her small kingdom of Gate B12 was a lifetime away. Daniel Henderson's fate was similar. Blacklisted from every major corporation, his name a byword for managerial incompetence and moral cowardice, he lost his house and his prestige. He tried to sue for wrongful termination, but the mountain of evidence from the internal investigation Seraphina had launched was so damning that no lawyer would take his case. He became a cautionary tale whispered in corporate break rooms, for the Vance family life transformed. They moved from the opulent penthouse into a more modest, though still beautiful brownstone. Seraphina poured all her energy into the new foundation, working with the same fierce intensity she had used to build her airline. She was no longer a CEO. She was a crusader. Jordan and Jamal, fresh off their triumphs in Vienna, became reluctant celebrities. They were invited on talk shows and featured in magazines. At first, they just wanted to talk about their music, but they quickly realized they had a bigger platform. They spoke with eloquence and passion about their experience, not with bitterness, but with a call for understanding and change. They became ambassadors for their mother's initiative, their story a powerful testament to why it was needed. Their music took on a new depth, a new resonance. They had found their voice in more ways than one. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after the incident, Seraphina and her sons were walking through Central Park. The leaves were turning, painting the city in hues of gold and crimson. "Do you ever miss it?" Jordan asked, his hands in his pockets. "The company, the planes." Seraphina watched a leaf drift down from a maple tree. "I miss the challenge," she admitted, "but I don't miss the title. For years I built a brand. Now we're building a legacy. A brand can be bought and sold. A legacy is forever." She smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile they hadn't seen often in her CEO days. What happened at that gate was ugly and painful, but it revealed a crack not just in my company, but in the world. And it's given us a chance to fill that crack with something better. They walked on 3 figures against the backdrop of the city. They no longer owned an airline that soared through the skies. Instead, they were charting a new course, one that was perhaps harder and less glamorous, but infinitely more meaningful. They were building something on the ground that was designed to lift everyone higher. 4 years had passed. The raw, jagged wound of the JFK incident had long since scarred over, leaving behind a story that felt both deeply personal and strangely distant, like a chapter from someone else's biography. The world had moved on as it always does. Apex Global Airways had fully absorbed Aura Air, its distinctive sky blue livery, vanishing from airports replaced by Apex's sterile corporate branding. Marcus Thorne had his bigger empire, and the news cycle had long since forgotten the names Karen Miller and Daniel Henderson. But for the Vance family, the echo of that day remained not as a painful memory, but as the foundational chord of a new symphony. Tonight, that symphony was playing at Carnegie Hall. The Vance brothers were no longer just promising young talents. They were a phenomenon. Jordan, now 21, had a stage presence that was both powerful and introspective. His command of the cello was absolute, capable of drawing out sounds that were ferocious one moment and heart-wrenchingly tender the next. Jamal, his mirror image across the stage, had become one of the preeminent violinists of his generation. His playing was technically flawless, but his true genius lay in his interpretation, a soulful, almost spiritual connection to the music that left audiences breathless. They had just finished their final piece, a complex, emotionally charged duet they had composed themselves titled Gate B12. It was not a literal retelling, but an abstract exploration of chaos, injustice, defiance, and finally a soaring, transcendent resolution. It had become their signature piece. The final note hung in the hallowed air of the main hall for a heartbeat thick with emotion before the room erupted. The applause was a physical wave of sound, a roar of appreciation that washed over the two young men as they took their bows, their faces slick with sweat, their chests heaving. Backstage, the energy was electric. Patrons, critics, and fellow musicians buzzed around them offering congratulations. Seraphina was there, her eyes shining with a pride that was fierce and profound. She was no longer a CEO in a power suit, but the head of a global foundation, dressed in an elegant but understated gown. Her power was softer now, but no less formidable. As the crowd began to thin, a young woman in her early 20s hesitated at the edge of their dressing room. She was holding a program clutched tightly in her hands, her expression a mixture of awe and crippling nervousness. Jamal noticed her first offering a kind and disarming smile. "Can we help you?" he asked. The young woman took a deep breath and stepped forward. I'm sorry to intrude. My name is Elara Martinez. I had to thank you. For the music. We're glad you enjoyed the performance," Jordan said, his voice still carrying the adrenaline of the stage. "For more than the music," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm a pianist. I'm in my final year at Juilliard." Seraphina's eyes lit up with recognition. "Martinez, of course. You're the recipient of our first inaugural Visionary Artist Scholarship from the Vance Initiative. Your professors say you are one of the most gifted pianists they have ever taught." Tears welled in Elara's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "That scholarship, it was everything," she finally managed to say. "I grew up in the Bronx. My family, we had nothing. My piano was a second-hand keyboard my dad found. The idea of a place like Juilliard wasn't even a dream. It was like a fairy tale from another planet." She looked directly at Jordan and Jamal, her gaze intense. "I remember when I was 17, I was getting ready to give up, to just get a regular job after high school. Then I saw your story on the news. I saw the video." Jordan and Jamal exchanged an uneasy glance. The video was a part of their past they rarely revisited. It felt like watching a home movie of your own humiliation. "I know it must be painful to think about," Elara said, sensing their discomfort. "But you have to understand what it looked like to a girl like me. I saw two young men who looked like they could be from my neighborhood, standing there with so much dignity while the world was being unto ugly to them. And then I saw your mother, and I saw what happened next. You didn't just get an apology. You didn't just get revenge. You took the ugliest thing imaginable, and you built something beautiful out of its ruins." She took another shaky breath. "When I heard about the Vance Initiative, it felt fated. I saw your story, and it gave me the courage to not give up. I practiced until my hands were numb. I applied thinking it was a 1 in a billion shot. When I got that letter, it wasn't just about the money. It was a message. It was like you were telling me that people like us, people who the world sometimes tries to stop at the gate, we deserve to fly too. The room was silent, save for Ilara's quiet emotion. Her words had reframed the entire incident. For years, Jordan had harbored a residual anger, a feeling that they had been forced to sacrifice their mother's empire because of two hateful people. He saw the sale of Aura Air as a loss, a magnificent corporate ship scuttled to prove a point. But looking at Ilara, at the raw, brilliant talent that was about to be unleashed on the world, because of that loss, he finally understood the depth of his mother's strategy. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about changing the terms of the game entirely. The $100 million endowment was a far more powerful weapon against injustice than a fleet of airplanes had ever been. Jamal, who had wrestled more with the emotional scars, felt a sense of profound release. He had often felt the weight of being a symbol, a poster child for a cause he hadn't chosen. He just wanted to be a musician. But Ilara's story made him realize that the two things were not separate. Their story gave their music a deeper purpose, and their music gave their story a voice that could reach into halls like this one and hearts like hers. Their art wasn't diminished by their advocacy. It was magnified by it. The notes they played carried the weight of experience and the hope of a better world. After Ilara had tearfully departed, promising to send them tickets to her graduation recital, the three Vances were alone in the quiet dressing room. "She's incredible," Jordan said, his voice thick with emotion. "There are hundreds more like her now," Seraphina said softly. "In music programs, in arts administration, in pilot training schools, all funded by the foundation." Jamal looked at his mother, his expression one of deep adult understanding. "You knew, didn't you, that day when you made the deal with Thorne? You saw all of this." Seraphina smoothed down the lapel of Jordan's performance jacket, a small maternal gesture that seemed to anchor them all. "I didn't see her specific face," she said, "but I saw the possibility of her. I realized that owning an airline meant I was in the business of transportation. But what I really wanted was to be in the business of transformation. I couldn't do that while fighting for market share and fuel prices. The incident at the gate, it was a terrible, painful gift. It showed me a different way to own the sky." They stood there for a moment, the family Vance. Not a dynasty of corporate power, but the architects of a new kind of legacy one measured not in stock prices or assets, but in the soaring flight of a young pianist from the Bronx and all the others who would follow. The echo of Gate B12 was no longer a sound of conflict. It was the resonant, beautiful first note of 1,000 new songs. The story of Jordan Jamal and Seraphina Vance is a whirlwind of drama, injustice, and ultimately profound transformation. It reminds us that prejudice isn't just an abstract concept. It's a real and damaging force wielded by ordinary people in positions of petty power. But it also shows us that the response to that prejudice can be even more powerful. It's a story where the consequence for a hateful act wasn't a simple firing, but the complete unraveling and rebuilding of an empire into something with a greater purpose. While the names and the airline are fictional, the core of this story, the reality of racial profiling and the resilience of the human spirit, is all too real. What did you think of Seraphina's ultimate decision? Was it surrender, or was it victory? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that matter. Thank you for listening.